Good afternoon. My name is Ajamu Baraka. I'm the National Organizer for the Black Alliance of Peace and a contributor, editor for the online magazine Black Agenda Report. Thank you for joining us this afternoon for this very important conversation. The title of today's program is The Case for an Independent Left Party, which emerges from a very important book written by Howie Hawkins, who is currently the Green Party nominee for the presidency of the United States. We have a very engaged and lively panel this afternoon. And so let me just quickly share with you the bios. Of course, we have Howie Hawkins, who is the Green Party nominee for President of the United States for the Green Party. Howie was the first candidate to run on a fully developed Green New Deal in 2010, combining an economic bill of rights to jobs, income, housing, health care, and education with 100 clean energy by 2013 in order to reconstruct the economy for economic justice and climate safety. He is author of The Case for an Independent Left Party from the Bottom Up. We're joined also too with Bhaskar Sunkara, a founder and editor of Jacobin magazine, which was launched in 2011 and is a leading publication of socialist analysis. He is a former vice chair of the Democrat Socialists of America and the author of the Socialist Manifesto, The Case for Radical Politics in an Era of Extreme Inequality. He is a supporter of Bernie Sanders in 2016 and 2020. He has endorsed Howie Hawkins in the general election. Last, but of course not least, we have Krystal Ball, who is the co-host of Rising on Hill TV. She was a regular contributor to MSNBC beginning in 2011. She is the author of Reversing the Apocalypse, Hijacking the Democratic Party to Save the World, which was published in 2017. She has a second book with her co-host, The Populist Guide to 2020, A New Right and New Left Are Rising. She's a supporter of Bernie Sanders this year in the primary. Since the nomination of Joe Biden, she has not endorsed any candidate in the general election. So let's get right into the conversation. First, Howie, since you are the key here, let's start with you explaining to us why a new independent working class party.
Well, let me first say that I'm in Mobile, Alabama, helping a young woman named Shakisha Clemens in her race for the city council of Pritchard, Alabama. Shakisha, you may have heard, got in an incident with the police at a Waffle House. Ben Crump is suing Waffle House in a civil rights case. The legal proceedings of the charges against her are still going through the courts, but she's a resilient person and she's running for city council. And that's why I'm down here in Alabama, and I'm working off the hotspot on my phone. So if I break up, that's the reason, and we'll just do the best we can with the technological limitations. So why an independent left party? We're living in a period where we've had about 80 years where most of the left has tried to work through the Democratic Party. And I think the result of that is that people that go into the Democratic Party from the left, they get tamed, they get co-opted. They have to adapt to what the Democratic Party is in order to stay relevant within it. They let progressives give speeches, but the corporate wing makes the decisions. And after the primaries, the reformers got to get behind the corporate wing or they'll be isolated. And so what has happened is the left, the socialist left, as a distinct and independent voice in American politics has largely disappeared. certainly in the electoral process. Now you go 100 years before that, from the 1830s to the 1930s, and third parties really set the agenda for the country. In fact, America had the first Labor Party, the working men's parties, in 1829, 1830. Karl Marx was 6 years old, and we had the first Labor Party with a socialistic agenda. And the next round was the Liberty Party, which evolved into the Free Soil and then the Republican parties. And they put the issue of slavery, which the old Whigs and Democrats kept compromising on but weren't opposed to. And after the Civil War, we had the populist farmer labor parties, the Greenback Labor and the People's Party. And they put issues like money and banking reform, anti-monopoly, public ownership of utilities on the public agenda. And they kept fighting for the voting rights that supposedly Black people got from the Civil Rights Amendments after the Civil War, but were being denied as Jim Crow was being built in the South. And then the Socialist Party in the early part of the 20th century put the issues of social insurance, what we call a job guarantee today, public jobs for the unemployed, public enterprise in basic industry for a socialistic economic democracy. And those are issues that were up for debate, and the third parties made them issues. And they elected thousands to local offices, hundreds to state legislatures, and scores to Congress. By the 1930s, there was a Progressive Party in Wisconsin and a Farmer Labor Party in Minnesota. Between them, they had 2 governorships, 4 senators, and 13 members of Congress. And there was a real move toward a Labor Party in 1936. Now that got co-opted because what happened was the communists, which were the biggest group on the left at that time, adopted a policy of coalition inside the New Deal coalition. And then the Socialist Party followed in the 50s and 60s with their realignment strategy, again, working inside the Democratic Party. We've had many efforts, the McGovern New Politics, Jesse Jackson's Rainbow Coalition, and now Bernie Sanders' political revolution. And the left as a distinct voice has just not appeared. So that's part of my argument, that we got to get back to that. And one thing we need to do in this country is establish a mass membership dues-paying party. That's an invention of the labor left around the world. Because the old parties that grew out of caucuses of parliaments and legislatures were sponsored by rich folks. And, like in Britain, it was the Whigs and the Tories. There was no membership. The people didn't have a real say. And the Labor Party came along and they had local branches. Members had a say. In our country, we're modeled more on the old model where there's no membership. You tell the state which party you're in, either by registering it or picking up their ballot at a primary, and you have no rights inside the party organization. It's a very top-down structure. It's financed by wealthy people who kind of pre-select who the serious primary candidates are. So this independent party needs to be self-funded. I mean, Bernie Sanders showed us how to do that. Lots of people giving lots of small contributions. But it needs to be a party that's independent of the Democratic Party or it gets lost in the sauce. I mean, now we're in a situation where everybody wants Trump out. The question is, how are you going to vote against Trump? You vote for Biden and you're for Medicare for all. He's against Medicare for all. So you just voted against what you want. The green ticket's a way to vote for Medicare for all. So I think we need a working class party on the left to unify the working class. You look at our movements in this country, all the reform movements, racism was the Achilles heel. We were divided by race, mainly because white leadership played down anti-racism in order to pander to white biases and ended up keeping us divided and weak. And then within the working class, we got public and private employees, we got union, non-union, we got big business, small business, and the capitalists, play that off. Like they get private sector workers to resent the good pensions and benefits that public sector workers, non-union to union workers, and so forth. Mm-hmm. So we need a party with local chapters where people can come together and find their common interests. And then the subtitle of the book is From the Bottom Up. And I mean that in 2 senses. One is that we got to organize the working class people, particularly the people who don't vote. 100 million people didn't vote in 2016. They tend to be working class people, predominantly people of color and young people. And we need to bring them into the political process. They're a working class majority in this country. So organize the people who are most exploited and oppressed. And the second point about From the Bottom Up is that We got to build this from the bottom up by running candidates for local office and building a political foundation and an institutional foothold in government, and then go to state and Congress and become a major force in power in American politics. And the last thing I point out is that I think the conditions are ripe for this. Working class was about 1/3 of the population in 1900. Today, it's about 2/3. You even have a middle class that would ally with working class interests, because a lot of them are well educated with progressive values, and they are facing increasing being pushed into the working class. Even nurses and doctors and teachers who had some autonomy and professional autonomy are increasingly subject to corporate organization. Working class living standards have been declining for 40 years. In fact, working class life expectancy has been in decline in recent years. We have the urgency of issues like the climate crisis. And then you look at public opinion, and public opinion on these progressive reforms is with the left. The problem of politics in this country is that public opinion doesn't translate into public policy. And that's what an independent party on the left can do. So that's what outline of the book.
Yes, and that's a very good outline. Let's come back to how we really get into a third party, but let's tease out this question of whether or not we in fact need a third party. Bhaskar, you are part of a formation that's been a very important element in a new kind of politics developing in the U.S. Your formation was very instrumental in pushing political discourse to the left and running independent candidates, and part of the Sanders insurgency. Are the conditions right now for a third party?
So on the conditions questions, I would say that no, right now there are not the conditions for the flourishing of a third party. On whether a new third party, a new left party is radically needed, of course, the answer is in the affirmative. It's hard to overstate the extent to which the United States is a failed state. We have 200,000 already dead from coronavirus. By the time this broadcast, it's going to be a lot higher. We have health and social welfare infrastructure far behind that of any other major nation. We have 40 million people in poverty, almost 30 million going hungry. You got 500,000 homeless. And this is in good times. This is before the worst of the post-coronavirus crisis hits. And this is, the wealthiest country on earth, the last remaining superpower. So this situation that we have right now is the real American exceptionalism. This is what American exceptionalism means in the 21st century. And at root is the fact that we've never had a party to advocate for the distinct interests of working class people. And without that Workers' Party, even the center-left parties you have in other major countries, the social democratic parties were able to, at the very least, build welfare states where we have a state that's completely unable to respond to social crises, and be it the slow-moving, grinding crises of poverty and neglect, or the acute crises of coronavirus and climate change. But the reason why I'm more pessimistic maybe than Howie is that, I think we have to operate within the reality of our undemocratic, awful political system if we want to change it. So that's why, even though I am personally as an individual voting in New York for Howie, and I proudly have voted for Howie 3 times. I missed his 2006 Senate race because I was not 18 then, but I voted for Howie 3 times for governor. I'll gladly vote for him in New York for president. But I think we need to advocate an approach that says that we have to run openly democratic socialist candidates, openly pro-working class candidates within often the Democratic Party primary system, then build and attach organized labor and other progressive elements to those candidates, then unite and discipline them, show that they have a different fundraising base, show that they're distinct from the priorities of a Democratic establishment, people like Nancy Pelosi, who I don't think care or actually know much about the conditions of working class people and poor people have to face in this country. And I think ultimately we'll end up forging the shell of a Labor Party within the Democratic Party. And if necessary, we'll have to be prepared to break from that party once we have the shell built and galvanized within it. I think personally that it'll be necessary. There's obviously some parts of the new progressive movement, like the Justice Democrats, that disagree. These folks are advocating something closer to the traditional realignment strategy of the new politics period and the Jackson campaign that Howie mentioned. But in the meantime, I of course think there's value in having a Green Party ballot line. There's of course having value in people registering dissent to the madness of American politics and the madness of this failed state with all the human costs that come along with it. But I'm not positive that there's a clear route to creating the kind of alternative mass party that we need. I see third-party efforts in the U.S. as continually running into the same roadblocks as they have since the success of Lincoln's Republican Party in the 19th century, the last real third-party success we've had. I obviously don't have an answer. As Howie mentioned, the realignment strategy certainly hasn't worked either. So I think we're at an interesting period for left politics, but we have to at least agree on one thing, which is the crisis of the Democratic establishment is something that we need to use to galvanize the forces of the left, to galvanize the independent voice of working people. Millions of them are no longer turning out to vote, are disengaged from the political system. These are the people we need to be reaching. And I think there is a difference between saying we need to tactically work in Democratic primaries and saying that our goal is to prop up the Democratic Party leadership. On that count, I would absolutely reject the idea that we need to just meekly line up behind a figure like Biden in this election cycle, or the Bidens to come in 2024 and 2028 and so on.
Yes.
But Bhaskar, I heard that Joe Biden has the most progressive platform in American history, and he's going to be the next FDR. I don't know what the problem is here. Obviously, I'm joking. I mean, I agree a lot with Bhaskar's perspective here. And I just look at recent history. It's very easy to feel extraordinarily frustrated with the fact that Bernie Sanders wasn't able to get through in 2016 and the system's rigged against him. And then once again in 2020, he's not able to get through. But you kind of flip that on your head and you look at the fact that no, actually, you had 2 election cycles in a row out of nowhere with very little infrastructure, with very little of the public conversation that's happening now, with very little of the burgeoning sort of independent media space where these conversations can even exist. You almost pulled it off, right? You almost pulled off the political revolution and realigning the Democratic Party and bringing in a new way of doing politics. And look, I'm under no illusions that even if that had happened and Bernie had won the primary and even won the presidency, that it would all be fixed overnight. But when I look pragmatically at what is the most likely path forward, not only can you point to those last 2 election cycles, but you can also point to other realignments in recent history that have not been in a direction that we would want them to go in, but that have nonetheless been successful that can serve as models. So the DLC, Bill Clinton corporatist takeover of the Democratic Party was incredibly successful, right? An intentional realignment strategy around the rising white collar professional managerial class. You know, Rahm Emanuel's still out there singing the praises of how we're going after the Biden Republican. That realignment was extraordinarily successful in the 90s and, you know, starting even before that. You can also look at the sort of Tea Party rebellion within the Republican Party, which pushed that party to the right and, you know, made it even more of a fiscal austerity party than it was before. You can also look, Trump had an opportunity to realign the Republican Party in a certain sense, but just ended up ultimately having, you know, zero ideology and getting co-opted by the same libertarian, well-funded Republican interests as always. But you can see how that strategy has come a lot closer to success in recent history than actually starting from the ground up with a third party. And I completely obviously agree with Bhaskar that I am delighted, Howie and Ajamu, that you all are out there, that you have the courage to run and to dissent. That's a very hard thing to do. And I know the kind of ugliness that comes at people just for daring to question, you know, the Democratic Party nominee, daring to say, actually, no, working class people deserve a candidate that's really going to represent their interest not just the language of representing their interests. But when I look at what is the most likely path forward, and I look at the obstacles to starting from the ground up with a true left third party, it seems much more challenging. And let's be clear, all of these paths are incredibly challenging, right? Power concedes nothing without a fight. And the media is obviously completely stacked against you. But there's such a loyalty to these two parties. And as you all know, look, if you run in the worst district in America for Democrats with a D by your name, you're guaranteed to get at least like 25 or to 35% of the vote just for having that D. If you run as an independent party, Green Party, any third left party, you have to work from literally every single vote from the ground up. And it just is such a difficult barrier to overcome. The ballot access issues, all of those things obviously play into it. And so so that's why, you know, I've really, as frustrated as I am at the current situation that we find ourselves in, it's why I still feel like the best chance for the working class to actually have a voice and have power is to co-opt the Democratic Party apparatus and, you know, kick out the old leadership, hijack it essentially to represent the working class. And so, you know, as I think about these things, I want to say that I have a lot of humility around it. And Howie, you know, I've read the book, and your study of history has shaped my thinking on a number of things and the way that third parties have moved the major parties as well. And I think that piece is really important to include in this conversation too.
Let me jump into it. I'm trying to moderate, but I'm also part of the panel. So let me just share a few comments also. I mean, it's a very, very interesting conversation in that these are many of the strategic questions we've been grappling with for quite some time. I ended up part of that effort back in the 80s, the so-called New Alignment process that the Jackson campaign attempted both in 84 and then again in 87, 88. My participation, though, was interesting in that in 84, this was the year, I think, where the progressives and radicals first started their long history of tailing the Democrats with this lesser of two evils. We came out, the formation that I was working with, we said basically to boycott the election in 84 because of some of the shenanigans that took place within the Democratic Party. But by 1987 or so, as a consequence of various experiences, I got on the Jackson campaign because I saw Jesse Jackson's efforts as the most valuable and potentially important effort to split the Democratic Party that I saw in quite some time, and that was my objective. I felt like that Jesse understood one thing, and that was the issue of power, and that if we could win Jesse as many votes as possible, as many states as possible, and we would go into that convention in 88, knowing that the Democrat Party was going to deny him the nomination, and that we believed naively that then Jesse would march us out of the Democratic Party, and we could begin the process of building a new formation. We felt that this would represent the exhaustion of all efforts to try to reform that party, beginning in 64. But of course, that didn't happen, and we know the history. The situation today with the insurgency, primarily from the Sanders forces, is a very interesting one. I still believe in the absolute necessity for independent politics, being outside of the duopoly. But for those forces that still believe that there is a possibility of change within that party, you know, I think there's a strong argument to suggest that even with the failures of the Sanders insurgency, that the conditions have not been exploited yet. That is, the possibility of that party being either captured or the party splitting is still in play. That one of the issues with this insurgency is that the individual who was the head of this insurgency, Bernard Sanders, wasn't prepared to go all the way. And he wasn't prepared to fight for real power, even if it meant splitting the party. So, the possibility of that party being captured, we'll see. But in the meantime, though, it's absolutely important for radicals to have an independent voice, a different approach to electoral politics, in which social movements and organizations engage the process in a different way than this candidate-centered process we have in the Democratic Party. That if we're going to be engaging the people and building independent power, we've got to do this collectively. This model of a candidate-centered electoral strategy, to me, is a failed one. And so the value of the independent route, of building independent political power from the bottom up, outside of the duopoly, means that the politics that we advance are crystal clear. We don't have to mask the politics, and the electoral work is part of a broader strategy of building independent, working class, revolutionary power. So, we're going to see what happens with this third party process. But how you even argue that a different kind of alignment, but a new left alignment, in that you suggest that even the Green Party itself, by itself, may not be the formation that can be the kind of formation that we have to build in this country. You say that we have to fuse the Green Party with the broader socialist movement and other progressive and left forces to build a new politics and a new party. Can you talk about that some more?
Yeah, well, the Green Party, as it's now constituted, is not broad enough. It's not a mass party. And more than organizing the left, which is pretty tough, we got to organize the people. That's why I say build from the bottom up. Among the people who are disengaged from politics, they're alienated. People say they're apathetic. I've knocked on too many doors in low income, Black communities, Puerto Rican communities, poor white communities, where people, they're following what's going on, or trying to avoid it sometimes because it's so painful to follow it because they feel powerless. And they are alienated from both parties because they feel like the elites in both parties don't know who they are, what their problems are, or really care about them. So Krystal said, people are loyal to the two parties, but you look at the polling, the number of independents is growing. The percent of people that want another third party is over 60%. So I think that's another condition that bodes well for an independent political movement. As far as heightening the contradictions within the Democratic Party till it splits by having a progressive wing, man, I've been hearing that since 1972. People around the McGovern campaign, socialists and Communist Party people working in the Democratic Party, heard it again, like you mentioned, with the Rainbow Coalition. I've actually heard it less from the Sanders movement. I mean, there are people like Bhaskar and some writers for Jacobin that do talk about, they call it a dirty break compared to what I'm talking about is just a clean break from the Democratic Party. But it seems to be even weaker as a trend. I remember Jane Sanders, Bernie's wife, going to the Left Forum a couple years ago and telling the audience of these supposed radicals, everybody here should register in the Democratic Party, which got a mixed response. And then the other thing is, Bernie, although he accepts the term democratic socialism, what he has really done is revived New Deal liberalism, because he wants to tax the billionaire class, but he doesn't talk about democratizing the wealth through a socialist economic democracy, public ownership and democratic administration of major industry, which you need to have a political democracy. Otherwise, the wealth is concentrated in the billionaire class, and that translates into concentrated political power. And so they resist the reforms that you're fighting for. And if they pass, they try to roll them back. So it's not a secure way to get those reforms. Somebody mentioned the Democratic Leadership Conference is realigning. I think what they did, that was defensive against the Jackson movement, the Rainbow Coalition. And they consolidated power of the corporate wing, which, you know, coming out of the McGovern movement, the leadership that became the political leaders, people like Bill Clinton and Gary Hart, they were what they called themselves back then neoliberals, and by the time of Clinton, the corporate New Democrats. And they replaced the New Deal Democrat consensus in the Democratic Party in the 1970s after Watergate. So what happened was, with realignment, the Dixiecrats went to the Republican Party, and the Democratic Party, in the absence of an independent left, just kept moving to the right. I remember Paul Strong was giving a speech saying, we got blacks, we got women, we got the environmentalists, we got the peace activists. All we need to do now is get the businesses. And Tony Coelho started a big effort to get more corporate money into the Democratic Party. So, you know, what I see when the reform movements go into the Democratic Party, they adapt to it. They go into change it and they get changed by it. Bernie Sanders couldn't break. The condition on him getting into the debates and into the primaries was that he promised not to run as an independent and burn that bridge. And if he had done that, you know, say after the 2016, he couldn't have come back and gotten those primaries and debates in 2020. Those are the kind of conditions you get into. Then on the clean break side, I mean, the Greens have 129 elected officials around the country. It's kind of one of the best kept political secrets in American politics. And you consider that there's 500,000 elected officers in this country, so it's a drop in the bucket. On the other hand, it's more than any independent party on the left since the heyday of the Socialist Party. And the Socialist Party showed that you can build this up from the bottom up. They fell apart for a number of reasons, but they showed for a while that it could be done. And the other thing I'll say is we can compete in these local elections because money isn't the big factor there. It's the ground game. You knock on doors, you talk to people. And the thing that you mentioned, Ajamu, is this party with local chapters needs to be active in movements between elections. I watched the Black Panther Party come up in the San Francisco Bay Area when I was coming up. And these service projects they did, they got their issues by having a storefront. People who come in, told them about sickle cell, told them about seniors getting mugged after they cashed their checks and needed, you know, an escort to go to the grocery store. They got a stop sign in front of Salem Elementary, or a stop light in front of Salem Elementary School. That community had been trying to get that because a lot of kids have been run over, and the city council was not responsive. The Panthers went out there with rifles on their shoulders, started directing the traffic, showed up the cops, showed up the council. They got the stoplight. And that's how they won a lot of support. And I think that's the kind of thing we need to be involved in. So when it comes around election time, people know that they know us, they know who we are, they trust us, they know we're for the people. And that is as important as running. And then when it comes to the money, when you move up, where it does make a difference to reach all the people, again, a mass movement with lots of little contributors, Bernie Sanders has shown that can work. So I think there is a path for an independent, a clean break from the Democrats, and we just build this independent party on the left.
Hey, Ajamu, do you mind if I ask you a question? Because Howie raised this, and I think it's such an important and kind of critical issue to the whole conversation, which is the way that race has long been the Achilles heel of a working class movement. I mean, what are your thoughts about how to build solidarity across, you know, a multiracial working class coalition? What are the barriers, and what do you think is the path forward on that front?
I think that the path forward is reflected in many of the policies that are being articulated by the Hawkins-Walker campaign. Policies that will benefit all members of the working class. We see African people primarily as working class people, and therefore the kinds of policies that will benefit African people in the U.S., of course, but also benefit the broader working class. We saw what happened during the so-called uprisings back in May and into June with the emergence of this multiracial resistance. And we saw the reaction from the state. They were scared to death. So the possibility of building a multiracial, working class oriented, revolutionary politics and movement in this country, I think still exists. But what has to happen for some of the white radicals is an understanding that while we advance a class perspective, we also understand that the class structure of African people in the U.S. Was profoundly shaped by issues of race and racialization, and therefore any mechanical understanding of class is a non-starter. Any politics that require that we erase our particularities to be part of the broader working class movement, if you will, under the hegemony of white workers and a white-led revolutionary process in the U.S. is a non-starter. It's not going to happen. And therefore, a real understanding of the issue of race and how it intersects with class and nationality and gender and all of those things that some people have issues with in terms of having an intersectional perspective but grounded in class, they have to be brought front and center. If not, then the issue of race will continue to be the Achilles heel of the radical movement in the US. And lastly, because we have a perspective that goes beyond the US, we say it's absolutely impossible. In fact, it's a manifestation of continued white supremacy to have a progressive politics in the US without an anti-imperialist stand. The fact that the US is involved in the systematic looting and the brutality and violence that this state is involved in globally, without any real opposition from the left in the US and in Europe, is a glaring contradiction that reflects the inability of left forces in the US and in Europe to understand the white supremacist nature of this colonial capitalist system that we have to name as the enemy. That's how we transcend all of the other contradictions. Once we have a clear understanding that all of these elements are connected, and that if we don't connect them properly, then we're never going to make progress here in this country. So on that response, Bhaskar, how do we move forward? What kind of politics can we really build within the attempting to operate within the confines of the Democrat Party, as you sort of make an argument for? What can you have a revolutionary politics? I'm not suggesting you're saying that. Can we have a revolutionary politics and build the kind of broad coalitions that need to be built to respond to the contradictions of the current moment?
Well, I think the key thing is speaking to people's day-to-day needs. And these needs, of course, are unmet by both major parties. And that begins with creating the broadest coalition possible around our key demands, like Medicare for all, like fighting for a jobs guarantee, like fighting for fair trade, like fighting against police brutality and our truly inhumane and staggering system of mass incarceration in this country. But that means building a coalition that can actually win some real gains for working class people. Because that's the thing that fosters about realignments and radical shifts in American politics. The New Deal, for all its faults, cemented a coalition that lasted for over 40 years because it actually delivered some gains for working people. Now, for the last 40 years, the Democratic Party has delivered absolutely nothing for people. At best, it's been able to say, we will be able to maybe divide up the pie a little bit more equally for oppressed groups, while in practice, Black and brown people fall ever further behind and real wages for all workers stagnate. So I think it's really important to talk about the need for this broad-based universal politics, a universal politics that I think need not necessarily sidesteps issues of race and imperialism, but one that says that everybody is welcome. And I know everyone on this panel agrees on this point, but everyone is welcome and everyone should take part into building this, that you have more to gain by joining this broad-based multiracial coalition than you do from the status quo. But we need to actually give people a reason to leap into the unknown. And right now, left-wing politics is a feel-good story. It's a story about figures like AOC and Bernie and whatnot that are incredibly charismatic and are speaking to many of these demands and feelings, but have ultimately not left behind, as of late, a legislative agenda that actually changes people's lives. So what happens when we finally deliver $15 and a union, when we finally deliver Medicare for all for people, will actually create the economic basis for a long-lasting coalition for left politics. And some of that politics will happen in Democratic Party primaries. Some of it will happen in independent third-party electoral efforts. But the vast majority of this politics will happen on the shop floor, in union struggles, in social movement organizing against racism, against war, for reproductive justice, and so on. But really, we need to talk about the great opportunity we have at the electoral level to pursue candidates that can get a national platform and can help us from the top of this platform organize from the bottom. You know, my approach on the left, I've been a socialist since I was a teenager. My approach used to be maybe a slower and more patient one. And that's the way I think in the abstract politics should be done. It should be about this deep-rooted, patient, long-term organizing, sinking roots in our communities, in our workplaces, and talking about a form of politics that isn't necessarily electoral. But what we're seeing now is that this tremendous opening we have is at the electoral level. Bernie Sanders was better able to reach people with left arguments and perspectives and a core, simple platform that people can grab onto, and also an enemy, the millionaires and billionaire class that he constantly talked about. He was better able to reach them than we had on the far left in decades and decades.
I think Bhaskar has frozen, and so that allowed me to jump in real quick and Krystal, on those points and other points. My question again, what kind of politics can we advance within the context of this Democrat Party? I understand the argument for having a figure that can garner attention from the bourgeois press. But what kind of politics are we really talking about here? If we are not talking about, even Bernie Sanders, for example, Bernie Sanders' socialism was basically a form of social democracy. I don't blame him. I think he helped to move the conversation forward and introduce the concept. But and in the end, he basically chumped out. So what kind of politics can we advance?
Well,
how we come to the thing?
I have spent a lot of these past few months feeling relatively pessimistic, but I want to sound a more optimistic note here, which is that the public has moved tremendously in terms of how they feel about Medicare for all, how they feel about Green New Deal. I mean, that shift in public perception and permission to think outside of the party duopoly box has created a dramatic opening. Now, I think you're absolutely right to say it's not enough, right? We have to go further. And so these sort of, I guess it's kind of a dark optimism that I have, which is that the pandemic and the economic collapse we're facing and the manifest, utter sham of our economy and the unbelievable, undeniable suffering and the unbelievable, undeniable apathy and contempt that Democratic and Republican Party leadership have for the vast majority of Americans is a horrifying, unconscionable, immoral thing to watch unfold. But it also, I believe, makes the case for exactly the kind of politics that we all believe in. And so I think it's unclear if we end up with the Trump administration, if we end up with the Biden administration. Both of those things could present massive opportunities for the left and to organize. I do agree with Bhaskar. Look, I find the idea sort of romantic of the grassroots organizing and start on the shop floor and start with the local candidates and build the bench and build power and build this mass movement from the ground up. But what I've witnessed just in the relatively short time that I've been engaged in politics, it's not actually local anymore. It's so national. It's become a national sport, a national pastime. And so if you have these figures at the top who can help pull and change and shape and shift national awareness and possibilities, it can dramatically accelerate the timeline that you're talking about. Now, that work at the grassroots level is essential, and you can't get there without it. But that to me is the more promising direction, is while you're doing the work, while you're organizing, while you're focusing on the grassroots building, also looking for those big play opportunities to provide the nation with the solutions that they really want, to provide the working class with the agenda that they actually already support, through a figure that they, believe has a chance of winning, of obtaining power, and ultimately of giving them some power in the affairs of this nation as well. So I guess that's my sort of dark optimism for the coming era, when you see so many, 2/3 majority of people actually saying, yes, we want radical solutions, and Washington just completely ignoring them from the leadership of both parties.
So Howie, you are a bit of a romanticist. You believe that we have to build from the bottom up. So what do we do about that? And what do we do past November? What would be the challenges past November, no matter who might win the presidency, assuming that you don't win?
Well, I think the romantics are those that think they can reform the Democratic Party or build a party within the party that will break from it. Because I think we've got almost, since the 1930s, a lot of waves of that effort that have failed. I think the question for us is, what are we going to organize? And I say we need to organize a party. We talked about not being candidate-centered and being organization and program-centered. And that's what a party can do. And we need to emphasize these local organizations, local chapters, because that's where the average person, the working class person, the person of color can get engaged and get active, get politically educated, find a culture and a movement that they can be a part of. And this goes to the question of how do we unite the working class across race lines, really across class lines too, because what we have now, the Sanders campaign, built around a campaign, Our Revolution, the sort of post-campaign organization, very top down. And, they didn't have an emphasis on organizing local chapters that have some autonomy in making their own decisions, setting their own priorities, doing their own activities. And I think you look at the Labour Party in Britain, why did Corbyn lose? He lost the Midlands. That's like the Rust Belt in this country. Traditional Labour bastion, working class people. And they got bamboozled by, the equivalent of Trump over there with Brexit. And one of the critiques is that the Labour Party, which kind of opened up under Blair, and that's how Corbyn was able to win, with a mass membership of small dues payers, but they neglected organizing the constituent Labour parties, which were the foundation of the Labour Party in the communities, in the Midlands especially. So working class people there, they just saw the national debate. There wasn't the Labour Party in their communities like it once had been. And I think that's the missing piece. If we can do that and organize the people we need to organize, the most oppressed and exploited communities. That's predominantly people of color, but there are a lot of white people too in that part of the working class. The part of the working class, the bottom half of the income spectrum, whose average annual income is $18,000 a year. They have a lot of interest in changing the way things are. but they need a vehicle to get engaged. Those are the people that are not voting. So I think the priority for the Green Party and anybody else that wants to build an independent left party is to build local chapters with an emphasis on organizing those communities. And that's not just running candidates, it's also working on the issues and helping people figure out for themselves how they want to tackle these issues. I mean,
it does seem like there's no skipping stages. That basically, what we see when you don't build a bottom-up process in which real democratic power is with the collective, then what we have is in fact what we had with Bernie Sanders, when the small group of folks around Bernie Sanders decided that Trump represented an existential threat. That meant that the movement is facing some serious demoralization. So, the model, as slow as it might be, as unglamorous as it is, in terms of systematic, persistent organizing, historically seems to be the most propitious route for how you really build independent political power. I want to raise a question, and we'll start with Bhaskar, in terms of what do we see as the consequence of a real constitutional crisis, as the consequence of this election, and all of the issues we see may be propping up, and what if we see again a situation where a Biden loses, but once again wins with the popular vote? What does that suggest in terms of the possibility of democratic reform and the kind of legitimation crisis that we see in this country? Bhaskar.
Well, at every level, the U.S. political system doesn't work. It's testament enough. If you listen to what Howie says, if you look at the platform this year or the platform that you participated in 2016, it's a reasonable left social democratic platform that in almost any other major country on earth would be represented by a left of center party. There's nothing extreme in the Green Party platform. It just so happens that the American political system is completely unable to represent the full political spectrum, the full array of views and interests in any system. You have multiple points at every level of government where a small minority can block legislation and progress. This is a political system that we have that is unable to cope with even predictable levels of polarization. So this buzzword about polarization is used quite often, but when social scientists actually look at what the United States is in terms of its increasing levels of ideological partisan polarization between Democrats who are becoming a little bit more liberal and Republicans who are moving even further to the right, they're finding that the U.S. isn't particularly an outlier when it comes to polarization. The real outlier is the fact that our system, unlike parliamentary systems, unlike systems with a stronger unitary government, is unable to cope with even these predictable levels of polarization. So what we need is constitutional reform. We need to begin with, obviously, get rid of things like the Senate filibuster and the Electoral College that we can do without constitutional reform. But even more deeply than that, I think we need to go beyond the Constitution and think about creating a more modern and robust democratic state modeled along the same lines as even other advanced capitalist democracies across the world, but one that also goes further and guarantees social rights. So in other words, it's a good thing that we have a Bill of Rights that guarantees the right of free speech, but what good is that right if we don't also have the ability to equally educate our children and house them and give them the nourishment that they need, and so on. So, this is a long crisis. It's going to be the defining thing in the next 30, 40 years of American politics, and it's going to be resolved one way or the other. Either it's going to be resolved in a right-wing way, and we're going to move in a more autocratic direction, or we're going to move in a more radically democratic direction. And I think that regardless of what happens in November, figures like Howie Hawkins are going to be remembered well by history. They're going to be remembered as people who were ahead of everyone else, just like he was advocating the Green New Deal in 2010, ahead of everyone else in 2020, talking about the real issues and talking about how to avert this crisis that we're heading into.
Krystal, we're going to be able to avert this crisis without a movement for democracy, and is a phase of neo-fascism almost inevitable in the U.S.?
I wouldn't say it's almost inevitable. I think that it's chaos theory right now. You know, you either go in radically one or the other of the two directions. It's impossible for me to imagine that neoliberalism is really able to hang on for a significantly longer period of time, even as it looks so ascendant right now with Biden and Kamala and the crushing of the Bernie left and all of those things, and the framework that's very useful to them maintaining the status quo of, oh, well, you just got to vote for us because it's the lesser of two evils. And if we can be slightly better than Donald Trump, then you got to go and show up to vote. And not only do you have to show up and vote, you got to be excited about it, right? You got to be like, show up with your Biden t-shirt on, and you better not say a word against either one of them. But if you look here, if you look around the world, it's clear that architecture of the world system is cracking everywhere. And what comes out of this pandemic, what comes out of the economic calamity that's facing working class people in particular, that's going completely unaddressed from the political system, I don't think anyone could possibly say, but I'm not so pessimistic as to say that a sort of fascism or proto-fascism is completely inevitable. I think there are equal and opposite forces on the other side that could be channeled, that could lead in a reckoning that actually moves the country in a better direction, a more just, more equitable direction, where people's civil rights are recognized, but also their fundamental economic and human rights are also recognized and attempted to be secured in some fundamental way. So to me, we're at this unbelievable pivot point, and it's terrifying to watch, frankly, unfold before our eyes. But to me, nothing is inevitable in terms of what the future might hold.
Exactly. Well, in our last couple of minutes, we're going to turn to Howie Hawkins to take us out. As an organizer, I can say that I'm excited. I know it's a very dangerous and complicated times, but I think with a campaign like the Hawkins Walker campaign and the kinds of issues they're raising and the possibilities, I think we are in a good place. Howie, is that true?
Yeah, I see a lot of potential. And I guess in the last couple of minutes, I just want to say to those people that are trying to shame Green voters and blame them for the election of Republicans, let's remember that in 2016, it was the suppression of the Black vote that elected Donald Trump. Take Michigan, 70,000 uncounted votes in Detroit because the Republican Secretary of State sent scanners down there that were broken. Never counted. And it was the Green Party, not the Democratic Party, that tried to get a recount. And that Secretary of State ruled, well, if you didn't have the same number on the machine that was voted on as the number of ballots you had, we're not going to do a recount, which makes no sense. That was suppression of the Black vote. And people want to blame the Green Party. It was a 10,000 vote margin in Michigan that put Trump over the top. Same thing when Nader ran in 2000. Jeb Bush was helping his brother and had the Secretary of State, Catherine Harris, suppress hundreds of thousands of Black voters, knocked them off the rolls. I mean, Greg Palast says there's probably 17 million people have been purged from the voter rolls because they didn't vote in 2 federal elections and didn't send a postcard back that looks like, a piece of junk mail. And so
we have 1 minute, Howie.
Going on. And then the other thing is both Bush and Trump lost the popular vote. Trump is a loser. He lost in 2016. It was the Electoral College put him in there, not the Green Party. So, you know, I'm shaming people back. If you want Medicare for all, you want a Green New Deal, you want to relieve student and medical debt, you want a job guarantee, vote for the Green Party. You vote for Biden, you're voting against those things. And, you know, make whoever's elected come to you. Don't give away your voice. Don't dilute your power.
Thank you so much, Howie, for those closing remarks. Thank you so much to Bhaskar and to Krystal. It's been a lively conversation, and I'm hoping that everyone listening got something from this. This is just the beginning of a conversation we have to have over and over again as we go forward. Thank all of you for being a part of this.
Thank you, Ajamu. Thank you so much, Howie. Appreciate you both.
Yeah, thanks for having this discussion.
Thank you.